Rome sent a conqueror.
And the desert returned a warning.
Crassus is dead.
And the eagles?
7 are in Parthian hands.
Then Rome has lost more than an army.
Hold the eagle!
Sir, they have taken it!
Let Rome remember Ky!
In 53 BC, inside the royal court of Armenia, King Orodes II of Parthia attended a lavish wedding banquet to celebrate a new political alliance. The evening's entertainment featured a performance of Euripides' tragedy, the Bacchae. But as the Greek actor Jason strode onto the stage to deliver the climax of the play, the prop in his hand was not a theatrical mask. It was the actual severed head of Marcus Licinius Crassus, its heavy, cold weight serving as a stark testament to the total annihilation of a Roman invasion force. The man who had effectively financed the Roman Republic marched east seeking absolute military glory, only to be reduced to a grisly centerpiece in a foreign king's celebration. The Battle of Carrhae ended in the slaughter of 20,000 Roman legionaries, but the physical death of a Triumvir was only the beginning of the nightmare. In the aftermath of the massacre, the Parthians captured 7 of Rome's sacred golden Aquilae, the legionary eagles. This was not merely the loss of battlefield standards. It was a profound desecration that inflicted a severe psychological trauma on the Roman state and permanently shattered the legion's aura of Western invincibility. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the geopolitical fallout of Crassus's execution, the resulting power vacuum that accelerated the collapse of the Roman Republic, and the desperate 30-year psychological war waged by Rome to reclaim its stolen eagles. How did the wealthiest supreme commander in the Republic find himself completely outmaneuvered and ultimately reduced to a theatrical trophy? To answer that, one must first look back at his final desperate moments trapped in the harsh Mesopotamian sand. The surviving Roman forces did not orchestrate a strategic withdrawal from the sands of Carrhae. They executed a chaotic death march. Fragmented and deeply traumatized by the relentless barrage of Parthian arrows, the remnants of the legions scrambled toward the rugged hill country near Seneca. The tactical logic was sound, as the steep, uneven terrain would finally neutralize the devastating mobility of the enemy cavalry. However, the geographic refuge offered no relief from the environmental executioner. The arid hills were entirely devoid of water. Profound dehydration began to unravel the structural discipline of the heavy infantry, stripping away the rigid order that defined the Roman military machine. Observing this vulnerable position, the Parthian field commander, Surena, deployed a masterclass in psychological warfare. He recognized that launching a direct cavalry assault up a fortified incline would be unnecessarily costly in blood. Instead, he rode out toward the Roman lines with his bow unstrung and his palm open, offering a formal parley. Surena loudly proclaimed that the king of Parthia desired peace with the Republic, promising safe passage for the legions if Crassus would simply descend the hill to sign a treaty. The Triumvir, a man who had survived decades of cutthroat Roman politics, instantly smelled the trap. He looked at the Parthian envoys and understood that their offer of mercy was a complete fabrication. Crassus formally refused the parley, but the Roman rank and file, their nerves completely shattered by thirst and the harrowing memory of the composite bows, would hear nothing of military caution. The command structure evaporated in an instant. The exhausted legionaries turned their hostility inward, surrounding their own supreme commander. They began to violently strike their gladii against their wooden shields, a deafening mechanical clamor that signaled an absolute mutiny. The soldiers screamed that Crassus was a coward, demanding he face the enemy in peace after forcing them to face the enemy in battle. The wealthiest man in Rome, who had built a career commanding the obedience of thousands, was suddenly reduced to a captive of his own terrified infantry. Stripped of his authority and heavily coerced by the threat of immediate assassination by his own men, the aging commander yielded. Surrounded by a small, tense retinue of lieutenants, Crassus began the slow, agonizing descent down the barren incline toward the waiting Parthian delegation, knowing with absolute certainty that every step carried them closer to a graveyard. As Crassus and his officers reached the base of the incline, Surena received them with a display of exaggerated diplomatic respect. The Parthian commander offered the Triumvir a horse adorned with a heavy golden bit, stating that the King of Kings wished to finalize their new treaty at the Euphrates River on horseback, as was customary for men of supreme rank. Lacking any authority to dictate terms, Crassus attempted to mount. The moment he was in the saddle, the Parthian grooms immediately seized the reins and began to violently whip the horse's flanks. Their intent was clear: to force the animal into a sudden gallop and physically separate the Roman commander from his remaining staff. The diplomatic facade vanished in an instant, revealing a brazen kidnapping attempt. Realizing the severity of the trap, the Roman officers reacted with desperate violence. Octavius, a senior legate, lunged forward and grabbed the horse's bridle, attempting to physically drag his commander back to safety. A chaotic, disorganized scuffle erupted in the dry dirt. There were no epic final words or honorable duels of champions, only the sudden flash of drawn steel in a tight, panicked circle of diplomats and guards. Octavius managed to cut down one of the Parthian grooms before he was struck from behind and killed. In the ensuing melee, a Parthian soldier named Pomaxathres thrust his weapon into Crassus, pulling him from the saddle and severing his head as he fell into the dust. The man who had financed the Republic and crushed the slave revolts of Italy died not as a general commanding legions, but in a frantic, ignoble street brawl. With their leadership systematically eradicated, the remaining Roman resistance collapsed entirely. Of the original 40,000 men who crossed into Mesopotamia, roughly 20,000 were slaughtered, their bodies left to bake in the arid hills. The historical record surrounding Crassus's remains soon descended into a grim, enduring legend of poetic justice. Ancient accounts assert that the Parthians, fully aware of his staggering wealth and the pure financial greed that motivated his unprovoked invasion, poured molten gold down the Triumvir's severed throat. Whether this execution was a literal battlefield reality or a subsequent embellishment crafted by historians, it stands as a profound symbol. It was the East's ultimate mockery of Roman corruption, a brutal testament that the man who sought to buy the world found that the desert only accepted payment in blood. The physical destruction of the invasion force was absolute, concluding a campaign defined by lethal arrogance. Crassus's headless corpse was left on the sand for the desert vultures, an unthinkable end for a member of the First Triumvirate. Yet, the slaughter of the heavy infantry and the desecration of their supreme commander were only the immediate physical losses. As the Parthian cavalry systematically looted the dead, they claimed battlefield prizes far more valuable than gold or iron. The grim arithmetic of Ky was staggering. For the 10,000 Romans who survived to be taken prisoner, the nightmare was only beginning. Bound in chains and stripped of their martial dignity, these captured veterans were marched hundreds of miles eastward, deported to the distant frontier of Margiana near modern-day Afghanistan. There, they were effectively erased from the Republic's military registers, forced to serve as border guards for the very empire that had orchestrated their ruin. However, the loss of 30,000 citizens, while devastating, was a blow the Republic could technically absorb. Rome had rebuilt its armies after the slaughter of Cannae, and it possessed the manpower to do so again. The true devastation of Ky was not written in the casualty lists, but in the capture of the 7 Aquilae, the golden legionary eagles. To the Roman military apparatus, the eagle was not merely a tactical rallying point or a piece of gilded metal. It was a sacred, consecrated totem, serving as the physical embodiment of the legion's collective soul and a direct conduit to the favor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. To lose an eagle in battle was the ultimate martial sin, an act of religious sacrilege that stripped a unit of its identity and disgraced the entire state. At Ky, 7 of these divine standards had fallen into enemy hands, a spiritual catastrophe without precedent. The Parthian leadership understood exactly what they had taken. They did not melt the gold down to fund their treasuries or hide the standards away in a royal vault. Instead, the Parthian king ordered the Roman eagles to be publicly displayed as permanent trophies within their own temples. This was a calculated, enduring insult. Every glint of light off the captured gold served as a permanent monument to Roman humiliation, fundamentally compromising the supposedly invincible aura of the Western legions. This desecration festered deeply in the Roman psyche, creating an open psychological wound that demanded a vengeance so absolute it would consume the foreign policy of the Republic for a generation. But the immediate shockwave of the defeat could not wait 30 years to exact its toll. As the few surviving stragglers staggered back into the safety of the Syrian province and the horrific magnitude of the disaster was confirmed, the news began to race westward across the Mediterranean. This dark tide of information was not merely bringing grief to the families of the fallen, it was carrying a geopolitical earthquake destined to permanently shatter the delicate political balance that held the capital together. When the courier ships bearing the casualty lists from Syria finally dropped anchor in Italy, the shockwave struck the marble halls of the Roman Senate with devastating force. For nearly a decade, the Republic had not been governed by the traditional laws of its constitution, but by the First Triumvirate, a delicate, extra-legal syndicate of power. This alliance was a precarious tripod supporting the entire Roman state. On one side stood Pompey the Great, the celebrated conqueror who had redrawn the maps of the East. On the other stood Julius Caesar, who was methodically building a fiercely loyal, veteran army in the grueling campaigns of Gaul. Between these two colossal military egos stood Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the indispensable financial anchor and the political buffer whose immense wealth absorbed the friction between his fiercely competitive partners. With Crassus decapitated in the Mesopotamian desert, that carefully engineered structure instantly collapsed. His demise in 53 BC occurred just 1 year after the tragic death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, stripping away the final personal and political restraints binding the two surviving warlords. There was no longer a third man to mediate the escalating paranoia, to broker backroom compromises, or to buy the necessary silence in the Senate. Pompey and Caesar were left staring directly at one another across a rapidly expanding void of ultimate authority. Crassus had marched east specifically to ensure he would be remembered as the undisputed first man in Rome. Instead, his elimination merely cleared the board, accelerating a binary showdown for absolute supremacy. Sensing the structural vulnerability, the conservative faction within the central government immediately moved to exploit the fracture, actively aligning with Pompey to legally strip Caesar of his provincial command and his legions. The geopolitical earthquake, triggered by the Parthian arrows, reached its violent climax just 4 years later. In 49 BC, the political stalemate broke entirely when Julius Caesar led his hardened veterans across the Rubicon River, choosing treason over political irrelevance. The Republic was instantly plunged into a devastating civil war that would systematically dismantle the 500-year-old senatorial order. Yet, while the Roman elite turned their heavy infantry against one another to decide the future of the state, the eastern frontier remained a festering, unavenged humiliation. The Republic burned itself to the ground to determine a single master, but the ghost of Carhae and the glint of the stolen golden eagles displayed in foreign temples patiently waited. They waited for the civil wars to end, and for a new supreme commander bold enough to finally march back into the scorching sands. For the warlords who emerged from the wreckage of the Republic's internal conflicts, avenging Carhae was no longer merely a military objective. It had transformed into the ultimate political prize. The retrieval of the 7 captured Aquilae became the defining test of Roman legitimacy. Any commander who could force the Parthian Empire to submit and return the sacred standards would achieve an unprecedented level of auctoritas, effectively securing unquestioned, absolute authority over the Roman state. By 44 BC, Julius Caesar, having defeated Pompey and secured the title of dictator in perpetuity, recognized that his legacy required this final conquest. To permanently erase the stain of 53 BC, Caesar meticulously organized a massive eastern invasion force, marshaling 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry to strike across the Euphrates. However, the immense logistical preparations were abruptly halted on the Ides of March. The sudden, coordinated flash of senatorial daggers on the floor of the theater of Pompey left Caesar dead, plunging Rome back into another grueling cycle of civil war. The grand Parthian expedition was stillborn, yet the political necessity of the campaign survived the dictator. The burden of this unfulfilled vengeance eventually transferred to his successors, falling squarely on the shoulders of Mark Antony. As a leading member of the newly formed Second Triumvirate ruling the eastern provinces, Antony found himself locked in an escalating Cold War with his younger, politically astute rival, Octavian, who was rapidly consolidating control over Italy and the Senate. To secure absolute supremacy in Rome, Antony desperately needed a military triumph of staggering magnitude, a victory that only the total conquest of the Parthian Empire could provide. Leveraging the immense financial resources of his alliance with Cleopatra's Egypt, Antony finally mobilized the colossal war machine Caesar had envisioned. He marched east with a juggernaut of 100,000 men, fully intent on reclaiming Roman honor through a war of absolute annihilation, completely unaware that his impatience was about to drive his elite heavy infantry straight into a logistical nightmare that would rival the very disaster he sought to avenge. Antony originally intended to correct Crassus's fatal geographic error. Instead of marching straight into the flat, arid plains of Mesopotamia where Parthian horse archers reigned supreme, the supreme commander selected a northern route. In 36 BC, he pushed his massive force of 100,000 men through the elevated highlands of Armenia and into Media Atropatene. The rugged topography naturally restricted enemy cavalry mobility and offered the Roman heavy infantry highly defensible terrain. However, sustaining an army of this magnitude required a sprawling logistical footprint. The core of this supply chain was a lumbering siege train of 300 heavy wagons, loaded with dismantled timber towers and massive battering rams required to breach eastern fortifications. The sheer weight of these wagons, pulled by strained teams of oxen, dictated an agonizingly slow pace through the steep, rocky mountain passes. As the short highland summer began to close, the pressure of the fading campaign season fractured Antony's strategic discipline. Driven by an impatient need to secure a decisive victory before the freezing winter arrived, he made a calculation that defied basic Roman military doctrine. He ordered his army to divide. Taking the elite core of his veteran legions and his mobile cavalry, Antony pushed aggressively ahead to lay siege to the Parthian vassal capital of Fraspa. Command of the vital siege train was delegated to a subordinate, heavily guarded by 2 full legions, but ultimately left trailing miles behind the vanguard. By prioritizing speed over operational security, Antony physically severed his striking force from its logistical anchor, isolating roughly 10,000 infantrymen alongside a highly flammable, static convoy in a landscape they did not control. The Parthian king, Phraates IV, immediately recognized the exposure of the Roman underbelly. Bypassing Antony's heavily armored vanguard entirely, swarms of Parthian mobile cavalry utilized their knowledge of the undulating highlands to descend upon the isolated baggage train. Tethered to the immovable wagons and unable to maneuver, the defending Roman cohorts were systematically dismantled. The Parthians slaughtered the rear guard and torched the 300 wagons, permanently erasing the expedition's engineering capability and primary grain reserves in a single afternoon. Stripped of his siege engines and rapidly starving outside the unbroken stone walls of Phraspa, Antony had no choice but to abandon the offensive and initiate a desperate 300-mile fighting retreat back toward the Armenian border. This withdrawal devolved into a grueling war of attrition, fought against the environment itself. The unforgiving geography of Media Atropatene, combined with dropping temperatures and a severe lack of caloric intake, executed what the Parthian arrows had only started. Roman veterans who had survived the worst of the Republic's internal conflicts were reduced to consuming toxic local flora in a desperate bid to stave off starvation. By the time the battered remnants of the expedition finally waded across the icy currents of the Araxes River to safety, Mark Antony had lost over 30,000 troops without ever fighting a decisive pitched battle. This catastrophic logistical failure drained his political capital, hastening his ultimate downfall. With Antony's colossal force shattered in the mountains, the prospect of extracting military vengeance for Ky appeared completely dead, leaving the next master of the Roman world to face the stark reality that swords and heavy infantry alone could not conquer the East. Following the destruction of Mark Antony's eastern ambitions, the Roman world was irrevocably transformed. By 31 BC, his younger rival, Octavian, soon to be granted the title Augustus, had crushed Antony at the naval battle of Actium, consolidating absolute, uncontested control over the entire Mediterranean. As the first true emperor of Rome, Augustus inherited the unresolved trauma of Ky, but he approached the eastern frontier with a fundamentally different psychology. He was not driven by the blinding insecurity of Crassus or the desperate political gambles of Antony. Augustus operated with cold, calculating pragmatism, valuing the domestic image of victory far more than the exorbitant cost of actual warfare. Conducting a ruthless strategic assessment of the geopolitical board, the emperor concluded that the Parthian Empire was simply too vast and logistically hostile for permanent Roman occupation. The arid expanses of Mesopotamia and the rugged Iranian plateau functioned as natural geographic fortresses that systematically neutralized the heavy infantry of the legions. Augustus recognized that attempting to garrison the desert was a fool's errand that would only drain the imperial treasury and invite further military disaster. However, the political necessity of returning the captured Aquilae to Rome remained a paramount requirement to cement his absolute domestic legitimacy. To achieve this, Augustus executed a masterstroke of weaponized diplomacy. He shifted the battlefield from the sand to the negotiating table, exploiting a critical structural weakness within the Parthian central government. King Phraates IV was currently grappling with severe dynastic instability, facing internal usurpers and a fractured nobility. Augustus leveraged this vulnerability, offering the Parthian monarch crucial political recognition and the return of a kidnapped royal son in exchange for the stolen standards. Yet, the Roman emperor understood that diplomacy required the backing of undeniable iron. In 20 BC, he ordered a massive deployment of regular troops to the Syrian frontier. Under the command of his stepson, Tiberius, the legions advanced to the very edge of the Euphrates River. They did not cross. Instead, they established fortified positions, projecting a terrifying concentration of military force directly onto the Parthian border. It was a calculated standoff, designed to force Phraates IV to choose between a devastating two-front war or a diplomatic concession. The pressure mounted as the two superpowers stared at each other across the rushing waters of the Euphrates, leaving the world to wonder if 33 years of bitter Roman humiliation could truly be settled without drawing a single sword. The gambit succeeded perfectly. In 20 BC, without a single pilum thrown, King Phraates IV yielded to the geopolitical pressure. On the banks of the Euphrates, Parthian envoys formally handed over the captive legionary eagles and the surviving Roman prisoners of war to Augustus's stepson, Tiberius. The long, grueling nightmare that began 33 years prior ended with a quiet, calculated exchange of men and standards. For the aging Roman veterans who had lived as captives for 3 decades, feeling the heavy, polished gold of the Aquilae finally return to Roman hands was a sudden, unbelievable reprieve. For the imperial government, it was the ultimate political victory achieved at zero military cost. Augustus immediately weaponized this diplomatic triumph, mobilizing an unprecedented propaganda machine to reframe the negotiated settlement as an absolute military capitulation. The imperial mints flooded the Mediterranean economy with coins bearing the inscription Signus Receptus, standards recovered. He commissioned the famous Augustus of Prima Porta statue, its intricately carved breastplate depicting a Parthian physically submitting the golden eagle to a Roman representative under the approving gaze of the gods. The emperor gave the Roman populace exactly what it craved: the psychological restoration of their martial dignity, carefully packaged to obscure the reality that the Parthian Empire remained completely unconquered. Beyond the domestic theatrics, the return of the eagles marked a profound shift in Roman grand strategy. The disaster of Ky, followed by Antony's subsequent logistical ruin, forced the Republic, and now the newly forged empire, to finally acknowledge its geographic limitations. The Euphrates River was cemented as the hard, permanent frontier separating the two rival superpowers. The dream of marching to the edges of the Orient, which had driven Crassus to his execution in the Mesopotamian dunes, was permanently abandoned. In its place emerged a grudging, pragmatic coexistence. Rome recognized that while its heavy infantry could crush kingdoms within the Mediterranean basin, the endless, arid expanses of the East demanded an entirely different calculus. The physical wounds of 53 BC were eventually bound, yet the Battle of Ky endured as a grim monument to the lethality of arrogance. Marcus Licinius Crassus had believed that infinite wealth and political ambition were sufficient to command the desert, only to be answered with a slaughter that fractured the Roman state. Augustus ultimately secured the glory that eluded the fallen Triumvir not by forcing the legions into hostile terrain, but by recognizing exactly where the absolute power of Rome ended. The desert has no master, and it accepts payment only in blood. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.